The Lindsay Clancy case. A house in a quiet Massachusetts town. A young mother. A devoted father. 3 small children who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. On one January evening in 2023, that life ended. By the time police arrived, 3 children were dead, and their mother was lying outside the house, gravely injured, having fallen from a second-story window. She would survive, paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of her life. What happened inside that house is not in dispute. Why it happened is the question that has divided medical experts, legal professionals, and the public ever since. Was this a calculated act, carried out with awareness and intent? Or was it something else entirely? A mind so broken by illness that it could no longer tell right from wrong. The answer could determine not only Lindsay Clancy's future, but also how the justice system handles one of the most controversial mental health defenses in modern criminal law. Before we begin, if you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries that go beyond the headlines and examine the facts, the evidence, and the legal questions behind each case, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. We cover both ongoing trials and some of the most compelling criminal cases from around the world. This is the story of Lindsay Clancy. And this is the case that has forced an entire state to ask one of the most difficult questions in criminal law. Where is the line between mental illness and criminal responsibility? Who was Lindsay Clancy? Before any of this, Lindsay Clancy was, by most accounts, an unremarkable success story, in the best sense of the word. She was a labor and delivery nurse working at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most respected hospitals in the country. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. She spent her working life helping other families welcome children into the world. She was married to Patrick Clancy, and together they built a life in Duxbury, a coastal town south of Boston, the kind of place people picture when they imagine a stable, comfortable New England upbringing. They had 3 children in quick succession. A daughter, Cora, and 2 sons, Dawson and Callan. The youngest only an infant. By outward appearances, this was a family doing what a lot of young families do. Juggling careers, sleep schedules, and the chaos of raising 3 kids under 6. Co-workers and friends have described her as caring, competent, the kind of person you'd trust in a hospital delivery room during the most vulnerable moments of someone else's life. There was no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing in her public life that would have predicted what was coming, which is, in many ways, what makes this case so difficult and so important to understand carefully, rather than reduced to a headline. The days leading up to the tragedy. To understand this case, you have to understand what was happening to Lindsay Clancy in the months before January 2023, because both the prosecution and the defense agree on the underlying facts here. They simply disagree about what those facts mean, legally. After the birth of her 3rd child, Lindsay began experiencing serious mental health symptoms consistent with postpartum depression, and, according to her defense team, postpartum psychosis. These are 2 different, though sometimes overlapping, conditions. Postpartum depression is relatively common, affecting a meaningful share of new mothers, and involves persistent sadness, anxiety, and exhaustion beyond normal new parent fatigue. Postpartum psychosis is far rarer and far more severe. A psychiatric emergency that can include delusions, hallucinations, and a break from reality, typically emerging within the first weeks after childbirth. By the accounts that have emerged, Lindsay's condition was serious enough that she was placed on multiple psychiatric medications, including antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and antipsychotics. She received inpatient psychiatric treatment on more than one occasion in the months leading up to January 2023. Her husband, Patrick, has said publicly that he watched his wife deteriorate in ways that frightened him, and that he was actively involved in trying to get her help, taking time off work, coordinating her care, and staying close to her and the children during what he's described as an agonizing decline. This is one of the most important threads running through this entire case. Nobody disputes that Lindsay Clancy was seriously mentally ill in the lead-up to January 2023. The prosecution does not dispute it. Her medical records don't allow for disputing it. The question the trial exists to answer is not whether she was sick. It's whether that sickness meets the specific, narrow legal definition of insanity. The night of January 24, 2023. On the evening in question, Patrick Clancy left the family's home to run 2 errands. picking up a prescription at a nearby CVS pharmacy, and picking up takeout food from a restaurant the family didn't frequent regularly. When he returned, he walked into a scene no parent should ever have to face. He found Lindsay outside the home, severely injured, having fallen from an upstairs window. She had also sustained injuries consistent with a suicide attempt. Patrick called 911 immediately. In the course of that call, and in the minutes that followed, he discovered that his 3 children, down in the home's basement, had been killed. Out of respect for the children and their loved ones, we will not be reconstructing the specific method or physical details of their deaths. According to prosecutors, the 3 children died as a result of asphyxia. The youngest child, Callan, was rushed to the hospital and fought for several days before ultimately dying from complications related to those injuries. The focus of this documentary is not on the manner of their deaths, but on understanding the events that led to this heartbreaking tragedy, the investigation that followed, and the legal proceedings that continue to raise difficult questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and justice. What we can tell you is what happened next. First responders arrived. 2 of the children were pronounced dead at the scene, and the 3rd was transported to a hospital, where he died several days later. Lindsay Clancy was taken into custody after being hospitalized for her own injuries that left her permanently paralyzed. The investigation. In the aftermath, investigators from the Massachusetts State Police and Duxbury Police Department began building a timeline of that evening, piecing together digital records, cell phone data, and the movements of everyone involved. According to prosecutors, digital evidence recovered from Lindsay's phone shows that she looked up driving directions to the restaurant where Patrick was headed. A detail prosecutors say is significant because it suggests she was calculating how much time she would have alone in the house. That drive, according to what's been reported, takes roughly 13 minutes each way, meaning Patrick would likely be gone for close to half an hour once the restaurant wait was factored in. For prosecutors, this detail matters enormously because it goes directly to the central legal question of the case. Did Lindsay Clancy have the mental capacity to plan? And if she planned, did she understand what she was planning was wrong? The investigation also drew on physical evidence at the home, statements from responding officers, and, because of a request that was ultimately granted by the court, plans for jurors to personally visit the home, the pharmacy, and the restaurant, so they can evaluate the timeline and physical layout for themselves. The criminal charges. Lindsay Clancy has been charged with 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. She was originally also charged with 3 separate counts of strangulation, a standalone crime under Massachusetts law, but prosecutors dropped those charges ahead of trial, arguing they were legally redundant given the murder charges already before the court. It's a notable decision. Rather than stacking charges, prosecutors streamlined the case, which suggests they're focused on proving the murder charges cleanly rather than complicating the trial with overlapping counts. Under Massachusetts law, first-degree murder requires proof of deliberate premeditation, extreme atrocity or cruelty, or that the killing occurred during the commission of another serious felony. Prosecutors are expected to argue that the evidence, particularly the timing of the errands and the sequence of events that night, supports a finding of deliberate premeditation. The defense. Lindsay Clancy's defense, led by attorney Kevin Reddington, does not dispute that she caused her children's deaths. Instead, the defense is built entirely around a single legal argument, that she should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. To make that case, the defense is expected to present extensive documentation of Lindsay's psychiatric history, her diagnoses, her hospitalizations, and the medications she was prescribed, which reportedly included a combination of antidepressants, sleep medication, and antipsychotics. Central to the defense's argument is the claim that Lindsay was improperly treated, potentially over-medicated, under-medicated, or simply misdiagnosed, in a way that allowed her condition to spiral rather than stabilize. Patrick Clancy has filed a separate civil lawsuit against the medical providers involved in her care, alleging exactly this: that mismanagement of her treatment contributed to her decline. That lawsuit is not part of the criminal trial, but it signals the argument the defense's expert witnesses are expected to make on the stand. Some reporting has also indicated that, in clinical evaluations, Lindsay described hearing an internal voice directing her to harm her children and herself. If credited by the jury, this detail would be a significant part of the defense's psychiatric case. Though, as we'll get into, Hearing something like that doesn't automatically satisfy the legal bar for insanity. Massachusetts insanity law. This is the part of the case that decides everything, so it's worth slowing down. Massachusetts follows a legal standard rooted in the traditional Manhattan test for insanity. In plain terms, a person is not criminally responsible for an act if, because of a mental disease or defect, they lacked the substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct, or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. Two things have to line up for an insanity defense to succeed. First, there has to be a genuine, medically diagnosable mental illness or defect. Not just distress, not just a bad period in someone's life, but a real condition a psychiatric expert can point to. Second, that condition has to have made it so the person either didn't understand that what they were doing was wrong, or couldn't stop themselves from doing it even though they understood. Here's where Massachusetts law becomes especially important to this case. In most states, once a defendant raises an insanity defense, the burden shifts to the defense to prove insanity, often by clear and convincing evidence. Massachusetts does it differently. Once the defense presents even a relatively modest amount of evidence supporting a lack of criminal responsibility, the burden doesn't shift to the defense at all. It stays with the prosecution. The prosecution must prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant was criminally responsible at the time of the offense. That is a meaningfully defense-favorable structure. It means prosecutors can't simply poke holes in the defense's case and call it a day. They have to affirmatively prove sanity, which requires putting on their own psychiatric experts as part of their primary case, not just in rebuttal. The prosecution's case. Prosecutors, led by Jennifer Sprague, are expected to build their case around a theory that Lindsay Clancy retained enough awareness, planning capacity, and understanding of right and wrong that she should be held criminally responsible, regardless of the mental illness she was undeniably experiencing. Their argument is expected to rest on a few pillars. 1. The errands. Prosecutors will argue that sending Patrick out for a task that would keep him away for roughly half an hour, rather than something quick like grabbing the mail, demonstrates planning and an understanding that what she was about to do needed to happen while he was gone. 2. The digital evidence. The fact that she reportedly searched for driving directions ahead of time suggests, to prosecutors, deliberate calculation rather than a sudden break. 3. Her conduct afterward. Prosecutors may argue that her attempt to take her own life immediately after the children's deaths reflects an understanding of the gravity and wrongfulness of what had happened. The reasoning being that someone who didn't understand the wrongfulness of an act might not feel compelled to end their own life over it. 4. The core legal argument. Perhaps most importantly, prosecutors are expected to lean hard on a distinction that is easy for juries to lose sight of. Having a real, severe, documented mental illness is not the same thing, legally, as being unable to appreciate that killing your own children is wrong. Prosecutors will not argue that Lindsay was fine, or that she wasn't sick. They will argue that being sick and being legally insane are two different questions, and that the evidence shows she understood, at the time, that what she was doing was against the law and morally wrong. Patrick Clancy. Perhaps no figure in this case carries more emotional complexity than Patrick Clancy. A man who lost all 3 of his children in a single night, at the hands of the woman he married, and who has spent the time since publicly and unwaveringly supporting her. In an interview with The New Yorker in October 2024, Patrick said he wasn't married to a monster. He was married to someone who became seriously ill. He has continued to visit her, to advocate for her, and is expected to testify for the defense at trial. His testimony will likely be one of the most emotionally significant moments of the trial, not because it resolves the legal question at the center of the case, but because it puts a human face on the argument the defense is making, that the woman on trial and the illness that overtook her are two separate things. It's worth being careful here, though, about what his testimony can and cannot prove. A husband's love and forgiveness, however genuine, isn't legal evidence of insanity. His account of what he witnessed in the months leading up to the tragedy will matter to establishing her state of mind, but the jury's decision ultimately rests on the psychiatric and factual record, not on how sympathetic any one witness is. The expert witnesses. Given the structure of Massachusetts law, this case is going to come down, in large part, to a battle between psychiatric experts. The defense is expected to call forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Lindsay after her arrest, along with treating physicians who can speak to her diagnosis and treatment history. Their goal will be to establish not just that she was ill, but that her illness specifically prevented her from appreciating the wrongfulness of her actions on that night. Because of how Massachusetts's burden-shifting rule works, prosecutors can't simply rely on cross-examining defense experts. They're expected to call their own forensic psychiatrists to affirmatively argue that, despite her diagnosis and treatment history, Lindsay retained the capacity to understand right from wrong at the time of the killings. Beyond the psychiatric experts, prosecutors have reportedly listed well over 100 potential witnesses, including law enforcement officers, crime scene technicians, medical examiners, and civilian witnesses who may speak to the timeline of events and Lindsay's demeanor in the days and weeks leading up to January 2023. The judge has notably ruled that the defense cannot call lay witnesses who have personally experienced postpartum psychosis to describe their own experiences to the jury, reasoning that this case has to be decided on Lindsay Clancy's specific mental state, not on generalized descriptions of what postpartum psychosis can feel like for other people. The trial. Jury selection was scheduled to begin the week of July 20th, with the court seeking 18 jurors, 12 to deliberate and 6 alternates. The trial itself is expected to run 4 to 6 weeks, and jurors will not be sequestered during that time. The judge declined a defense request to split the trial into 2 separate phases, one to determine guilt and a second to determine sanity, ruling instead that the issues were too intertwined to separate cleanly. That means the jury will hear all of the evidence from both sides in a single continuous trial and will ultimately have to answer one overarching question. Is Lindsay Clancy criminally responsible for the deaths of her 3 children? If the jury finds her not guilty by reason of insanity, she will not simply walk free. Under Massachusetts law, she would be committed to a psychiatric facility, subject to ongoing evaluation and periodic judicial review to determine whether, and when, if ever, she might be considered safe for release. That process can take years, and in some cases, can last a lifetime. A broader question. This case sits at one of the most difficult intersections in criminal law, the space between mental illness and legal responsibility. It's tempting, understandably, to look at a case this devastating and conclude that anyone capable of doing something like this must have been insane in the way we use that word in everyday conversation. But the law asks a much narrower, more technical question, one that has nothing to do with how horrifying an act is, and everything to do with whether the person committing it understood in that moment that it was wrong. That distinction is why cases like this are so agonizing for juries, and honestly for anyone following along from the outside. You can hold 2 things as true at the same time. That Lindsay Clancy was suffering from a real and severe mental illness, documented over months by multiple medical professionals, and that a jury may still conclude she understood the wrongfulness of what she did, which under the law would make her criminally responsible. Neither side disputes the tragedy. Neither side disputes the mental illness. What's actually being decided is something much narrower, and much harder to determine from the outside than it might first appear. Conclusion. There are no winners in a case like this. 3 innocent children lost their lives. A father lost his entire family in a single night. And a mother who, by every account, once loved and cared deeply for her children now faces a future that will forever be defined by one unimaginable evening. Regardless of what the jury ultimately decides, we're not here to tell you what verdict is right. That's not our place, and honestly, it's not an easy call even for the professionals whose careers are built around understanding these exact legal questions. What we can tell you is what the jury has been asked to decide. Not whether Lindsay Clancy was sick, that much isn't in dispute, but whether her illness rose to the very specific, very narrow legal definition of insanity under Massachusetts law. As this trial unfolds over the coming weeks, we'll be following it closely, and we'll bring you updates as the evidence is presented and the arguments are made. Our goal is simply to present the facts, explain the law, and provide the context needed to understand one of the most emotionally complex criminal cases in recent memory. We'll continue following every major development and bring you detailed, fact-based updates as they happen.
Your Honor, may I proceed?
Yes, please.
Your Honor, before the court, we have the matter of Commonwealth versus Lindsay Clancy. Ms. Clancy is present. She is represented by Attorney Kevin Reddington, and the Commonwealth is represented by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Sprague and Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham.
If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future coverage of this case and other major true crime investigations. Your support helps us continue producing thoroughly researched documentaries like this one. And now we'd like to hear from you. Do you believe Lindsay Clancy should be held criminally responsible for her actions? Or do you believe her documented mental illness meets the legal standard for insanity under Massachusetts law? Please keep the discussion respectful in the comments. Cases involving mental illness and the loss of children are deeply painful, and thoughtful conversations help everyone better understand these difficult issues. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.